Hello, my name is James Nagy. Thank you for watching my video series, The End of the End Times. This is the second part of episode 7 of my presentation, which is a 10-part series based upon my book, also titled The End of the End Times. In this lesson, we're going to be continuing our analysis of the events that occurred during the Roman-Jewish War from AD 66 to 73. And in the first half of Lesson 7, we looked at some of the Bible prophecies spoken by Jesus as recorded in Matthew 24. And we saw how the prophecies spoken by Jesus actually pertain to events that occurred during the Roman-Jewish War, and that Jesus was not describing a future 7-year tribulation or end times thousands of years in the future. We're going to continue the same thought, but we're going to shift and start looking at passages in the book of Revelation. And specifically, we're going to look at the beasts of Revelation, and we're going to see who these beasts are. And we're going to see how Revelation, we're not going to do an entire analysis of the book of Revelation, but we're going to look at several key passages and show how these events were fulfilled or completed during the 7-year war between Rome and Israel. The first question we're going to ask ourselves is, when was the book of Revelation written? So the majority consensus among Bible scholars is that the book of Revelation was written by the Apostle John while he was on the island of Patmos. But the question that we might ask ourselves is, when was it written? Because this will greatly affect our interpretation of the entire book of Revelation, as we'll see. Many Bible scholars believe that the Apostle John wrote Revelation during the time of Nero, and since Nero died in AD 68, then it would have to have been written prior to AD 68. In other words, Revelation then would have been written prior to the destruction of Jerusalem and of the temple. Conversely, the early church father, Saint Irenaeus of Lyons, believed that John wrote Revelation near the end of the reign of Domitian, and this would necessarily put the date of authorship toward the end of the 1st century. However, the same Irenaeus understood the events in Revelation to refer to the apocalypse that occurred during the reign of the Roman Empire. And Irenaeus makes these remarks in his 5-volume set called Against Heresies. I believe these quotes are from, or these references are from, the 5th volume of his set called Against Heresies. And the important point here is that regardless of when John actually wrote Revelation, if we're going to accept Irenaeus as a valid source, then Irenaeus himself understood the events in the book of Revelation to be referring to the apocalypse that occurred during the Roman Empire. Well, we can look at several internal references, and we're going to look at several external references as well. That'll help in our understanding of when Revelation was written, and more importantly, to provide us some context as to what Revelation is trying to tell us. Does it have any message for us today? So let's look at John in his vision in chapter 11 in Revelation is told to measure the temple and the altar. Well, if John is being told to measure the temple and the altar, it would imply logically then that the temple and the altar are still standing at the time of the writing of chapter 11 of Revelation. Also, chapter 11 describes a period of 42 months or 3.5 years where a beast is allowed to exercise authority over the saints. And we know that there were 42 months from the start of the Roman-Jewish War until Jerusalem was completely destroyed. Now recall that the hostilities with Rome and Israel really got under steam when a Roman man named Gessius Florus plundered the money from the Jewish temple, and then the Jews started initiating hostilities against the Romans, and they went to Caesarea and slaughtered all of the Romans there. And that's really when the war really kicks in, and that's really kind of our starting point of the 7-year war between Rome and Israel. So with these passages and events, we can say that whether or not John wrote the book of Revelation prior to AD 70 or whether he wrote it at the end of the 1st century, the events described in Revelation nevertheless make references to the apocalypse or the 7-year war between Rome and Israel. So in other words, John could have been writing the book of Revelation prior to the 7-Year War or after the 7-Year War, or it's possible that he wrote part of the book of Revelation prior to AD 70 and perhaps wrote part of the book of Revelation subsequent to AD 70. So we don't know for sure, but we'll continue with our analysis of the internal and external evidences, and that'll help guide us as to the date of authorship. Let's talk about the fourth beast of Daniel 7. I'm going to go ahead and read two passages, one from Daniel and one from Revelation, that describe a beast. Now recall from Daniel 7 that there's a description of 4 beasts, and these beasts are generally accepted to be references to the Babylonian Empire, the Persian Empire, the Greek Empire, and then finally the Roman Empire. So I'm going to go ahead and first read from the book of Daniel, and this is about the fourth beast. This is beginning in Daniel 7, verse 7. After that, in my vision at night, I looked, and there before me was a fourth beast, terrifying and frightening and very powerful. It had large iron teeth. It crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all the former beasts, and it had 10 horns. While I was thinking about the horns, there before me was another horn, a little one, which came up among them, and 3 of the first horns were uprooted before it. The horn had eyes like the eyes of a human being, and a mouth that spoke boastfully. So, as we continue this second half of episode 7, we're going to find out the identity of the 10 horns, as well as the little horn that comes up, and we're going to see who the 3 horns are that were uprooted by the little horn that comes up from the 10. And before we do that, we're going to look at a similar passage in the book of Revelation, and this is describing the beast. So this is from Revelation chapter 13, or beginning with verse 1. The dragon stood at the shore of the sea, and I saw a beast coming out of the sea. It had 10 horns and 7 heads, with 7 crowns on its horns, and on each head a blasphemous name. The beast I saw resembled a leopard, but had feet like those of a bear, and a mouth like that of a lion. The dragon gave the beast his power and his throne and great authority to the beast. One of the heads of the beast seemed to have had a fatal wound, but the fatal wound had been healed. The whole world was filled with wonder and followed the beast. All right, we're going to look at these two passages together, and we're going to see that the beast in Revelation 13 and the beast in Daniel are in fact the same beasts. So Daniel describes the fourth beast in chapter 7, and again, it's generally recognized or understood that this beast is a reference to the Roman Empire. Well, interestingly, both the beast in Daniel 7 and in Revelation chapter 13 have 10 horns. And furthermore, Revelation 13 describes the beast as being like a lion, a leopard, and a bear. Now, these are the same animals that are used to describe the first 3 beasts of Daniel 7. In other words, the fact that the fourth beast is like a lion, a leopard, and a bear is a reference to the fact that the might of the fourth beast is so great that it surpasses the power and might of the 3 beasts that came before it. And this was certainly true of the Roman Empire. And then finally, we're told that the beast will trample the saints for 42 months in each passage. So with all of this information in Daniel 7 and Revelation 13, we can conclude then that the beast of Daniel 7 and the beast of Revelation 13 is the same beast. And each passage describes the beast as having 10 horns. So the question we might ask ourselves is, who are the horns? Let's talk about the fatal wound of the first beast. All right, before we can identify the 10 horns and the fatal beast of the fatal wound of the first beast, we must necessarily dive a little bit into some Roman history during the first century. Nero was emperor of Rome from AD 54 to 68. He was a singer and an actor, and at times preferred the entertainment circuit rather than leading the nation. Nero is the Roman emperor who, it's said of him, he was fiddling while Rome burned. This is a reference to a great fire that broke out in Rome, and while the fire was engulfing a large part of the city, Nero was out entertaining himself rather than adhering to his civic duties. So this is kind of the character makeup of Nero. And another point that's very important about Nero and the Roman Empire of this time is that while Rome was engulfed in paganism and Nero was giving bread and circus to the masses, Christianity was being preached, was preaching an obedience toward God. Now, this idea of Christianity teaching an inward peace and obedience to the one true living God ran counterculture to Nero and the paganism of the Roman Empire. And it was for this reason that the Christians were persecuted during the time of Nero. In AD 68, Nero killed himself. Nero belonged to the Julian dynasty of emperors. Now this is very important. The first 5 emperors of Rome are Tiberius, Augustus first, then Tiberius, Claudius, Caligula, and Nero. And these 5 emperors were said to belong to the Julian dynasty. They were related by blood, and they could actually trace their ancestry, or at least their bloodline, to Julius Caesar himself. Well, in AD 68, Nero had killed himself, but prior to that, he had killed all of the male descendants of the entire Julian dynasty. That meant that upon his death, upon his suicide in AD 68, there was nobody who could step forward and claim to be the emperor of Rome. So Rome was left in a disarray. And as a result of this, a great civil war broke out within the Roman Empire, with various men stepping forward and trying to take for themselves the throne of the Roman Empire. Now let's talk about who these men were. In AD 69, we have the year of the 4 emperors. This is actually a quote or a saying that you would find in history books. So AD 69 marks the year of the 4 emperors in the Roman Empire. The first of these was a man named Galba, who was the governor of Spain. Galba had no son, and so he adopted an heir who would presumably rule after his death. So Galba becomes the 6th emperor of the Roman Empire. The next man who would step up is a man named Otho, and he was governor of a region called Lusitania, which is made up of modern Portugal and parts of Spain. Well, the military threw its support behind Otho, and Galba was killed. So now we have Otho, who is the 7th emperor of the Roman Empire. After him, another man steps forward, a man named Vitellius, and he was governor of a region of Lower Germany. And after Galba's death, Vitellius marched to Rome with his troops, and as a result, Otho took his own life. So rather than having the soldiers of the 2 would-be emperors fighting among each other, Otho took his own life, and Vitellius now becomes the 8th emperor of the Roman Empire. And again, this is still in 69 AD. Finally, the 4th emperor who would rule beginning in 69 was a man named Vespasian. Recall that Vespasian was the Roman leader, the Roman general, who was leading the war against Jerusalem when the civil war broke out in Israel. The troops loyal to Vespasian killed Vitellius and supported Vespasian as emperor. Vespasian becomes the 9th emperor of the Roman Empire. So, with all this information, let's connect it all up together, the beast and the events that we know now from Roman history, and see if we can tie it all together and make sense out of Revelation. So let's talk about the first beast of Revelation. We know that the first beast has 7 heads, which represents 7 kings. And if we look at Revelation 17, there's a description of some of the kings of this empire. So let's assume for the time being, we don't know what Revelation 17 is describing, but Revelation 17 tells us that at the time it was being written, 5 kings have fallen, Well, I am proposing that these are the first 5 kings of the Roman Empire. So this would be Augustus, Tiberius, Claudius, Caligula, and Nero. These are the 5 kings who have fallen. The king who is would necessarily be a king who is still alive, and this would be the 6th king, which would be Galba. The king who has not yet come would be the 7th king, and this would be Otho, who ruled in 69 for a very brief period of time. The 8th king, according to Revelation 17, is going to his destruction, and this would be Vitellius. Now, we might say, well, how can Vitellius be one of the kings here that's being described? Well, Revelation 17 tells us that the 8th king belongs to the 7. So in other words, we have a grouping of 8 kings or 8 emperors of the Roman Empire, beginning with Augustus Caesar and concluding with Vitellius, who is the 8th emperor. Well, if this is true, then what would be the identity of the second beast of Revelation? Well, let's take a look. The second beast has 2 horns, which represents 2 kings. After the first beast suffered a mortal wound, the second beast appears, and this is from Revelation 13, where there's a depiction of a beast, the first beast, which suffers a mortal wound, and then after the mortal wound recovers, then there is a second beast that arrives on the scene. Well, let's connect this up with Roman history. While Rome was plunged in civil war, Vespasian departed for Rome to restore order to the empire, and he left his son Titus in charge of the Jewish revolt. So Vespasian heads toward Rome, leaves Titus to continue fighting against the Jews in Jerusalem, and at the time the troops loyal to Vespasian killed Vitellius, and they declared Vespasian to be emperor. Vespasian becomes the 9th emperor of the Roman Empire. And together Vespasian and Titus will go on to become the 9th and 10th emperors of Rome. These are the 2 horns of the second beast. The fatal wound that has been healed is the restoration of the Roman emperor under Vespasian. In other words, the mortal wound of the beast is not a reference to a man, a physical man who was killed or injured and then suddenly makes a miraculous recovery. The mortal wound that recovers is a reference to the Roman Empire and how it suffered a mortal wound, which was the civil war that Rome was plunged into after the death of Nero. And the recovery then occurs under the second beast, and the 2 horns of the second beast are simply Vespasian and Titus, the 9th and 10th emperors of the Roman Empire. These are the 10 kings of the Roman Empire. So the 10 kings of the Roman Empire talked about in Daniel and in Revelation 13 are simply a reference to the first emperors or kings of the Roman Empire. So let's look at this in a chart, and this will help us a little bit in understanding. I like charts because they help us to visualize a lot of information all at once. So let's take a look at this. We have a first beast described in Revelation 13 and chapter 17. And we can see here the first emperor of the Roman Empire is Augustus. And then we have Tiberius, who was the emperor during the time of Jesus' ministry. And then we have the 4 kings who ruled in AD 69. We can see we have Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and then finally Vespasian, who restores order in 69. And we can see here, again, if we line up the references in chapter 17 of Revelation, recall that we have 5 kings who have fallen. Well, this would be Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. The king who is, well, this would be Galba, who ruled briefly from AD 68 to 69. Now, this is very important. As John is writing the book of Revelation, he makes reference to a king who is. Well, the king who is would necessarily be the 6th king or 6th emperor of the Roman Empire. So in other words, at the time the Apostle John is writing the book of Revelation, at least chapter 17, he is writing during the period from AD 68 to 69, just prior to the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. Does this make sense? In other words, the book of Revelation is describing events that occurred between Rome and Israel during the 7-year war from AD 66 to 73, and the book of Revelation is not describing some far-off prophecy or end times or a future 7-year tribulation period. We can see all of this from the events that we know from Roman history and from the book of Daniel and from the book of Revelation. And then finally, as I said, the Roman Empire, the kingdom, is restored when Vespasian, taking his troops, marches to Rome to restore order, and the people, even before Vespasian gets to Rome, they throw their support behind Vespasian. He becomes the 9th emperor of Rome, and now the Roman Empire is restored, or in other words, the fatal wound of the beast is recovered. So all of this shows us that these events described in Daniel 7 and the book of Revelation are making reference to the 7-year war between Rome and Israel. And I hope this is clear, and I thank you for watching this presentation, and I hope you join me next time for episode 8 of the series. Thank you for watching.